Hello and welcome to FP Live. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief. We've all been focused on trade recently. The White House's baseline 10% tariffs on most of the world and its much higher tariffs on China threaten to disrupt supply chains and partnerships everywhere. Now, a lot of this discussion tends to focus on the biggest economies, but it's worth also asking, what happens to everyone else? What happens to smaller sized economies that, for the last few decades, really came to depend on free trade in an interconnected world? And to put it more provocatively, are we now seeing the end of globalization? In a moment, we will speak with two experts on this topic. If this is your first time joining us on FP Live, welcome. We take some subscriber questions and we certainly channel them in our line of questioning. If you'd like to join in, sign up and use the code FP Live for a discount. We also have a special Ask Me Anything episode coming up next week. Send in your questions right on this website. And of course, if you can't catch the video, you can also follow us on our free podcast. Just look for FP Live wherever you get your audio. Now, globalization probably reached its peak sometime between the 1990s and the early 2000s. Free trade was seen as an unabashed good thing. And then the so-called China shock, when low-cost Chinese exports flooded global markets. To combat that, in recent years, soft forms of protectionism were already taking off, as regular followers of FP Live know. But Trump's tariffs threaten a much more heightened era of protectionism. So, what will it do to global trade? How will it impact countries beyond just China? And what will it do to the dollar? Joining me now, Eswar Prasad is a professor of trade policy at Cornell University and the author of books such as The Future of Money. And Elisabeth Braw is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, an FP columnist, and the author, most recently, of Goodbye Globalization, The Return of a Divided World, a very aptly titled book. Welcome to you both. Eswar, I'm going to start with you. So, focusing just on Trump's tariffs for a minute, how are they going to impact global trade?
As you alluded to, Ravi, there were already some changes happening in the nature of globalization. Now, it's worth thinking about what the promise of globalization was and what it means in the first place. It's broader trade and financial integration. And the idea was that this would lift up everybody. So investors around the world, including in advanced economies, would have access to better investment opportunities. There would be global pools of capital that even firms in developing countries could rely on. So everybody would be made better off. Now, of course, there were distributional consequences within each country. Certainly, all Americans may have been made better off by globalization, but try telling that to the Detroit auto manufacturers. So we were in a position where I think there was a bit of a backlash about the distributional consequences of globalization, and that took on a significant life of its own. It's much harder to see the benefits of globalization because these tend to be more broadly distributed, while the costs are much more concentrated. So what we seem to be in the middle of right now is a backlash against globalization, the sense that it did not work very well for all people and did not work well at all for certain countries. Many developing countries ended up taking on too much debt and their populations are suffering as a consequence. Now, it's not quite right that globalization is to blame for all of this. There were many policy mistakes undertaken in certain countries. There were issues about how certain countries were not playing fair. And the thing about Donald Trump, of course, is that when he says things, a lot of it is not true, but sometimes there is a kernel of truth to what he says. Some countries did not entirely play fair by trade. So that backlash is now leading to a stage where I think even trade, let alone finance, is no longer seen as a positive sum game where everybody benefits and is being seen as a zero sum game. And certainly there was some changes already coming, but Trump's tariffs are really going to make a big difference. And the question is, how do firms, how do countries respond? And I think the big theme is going to be a shift away from efficiency, meaning, for instance, mean and lean supply chains, towards diversification, because what we've seen right now is that the risks have increased. Climate related risks that could affect supply chains have increased. Geopolitical risks have increased. And now we have policy induced risks such as tariffs. So I wouldn't quite call it the end of globalization yet, but it's certainly going to morph into a very different form.
Well, Elizabeth, you wrote a book called Goodbye Globalization, and you've been arguing for some time now that there's been a shift away from open borders, from free trade, from globalization. Talk to us, build on what Eswar was talking about. Why was that shift underway, and how was it manifesting itself before Trump, admitting that Trump himself is going to be a huge accelerant in that process?
Well, it's fascinating to watch how over the past decade or so, faith in globalization has plummeted, and not just among people who count, but also among ordinary people. And so when I started becoming interested in this was when we started seeing so-called ordinary citizens speaking up against or voicing unhappiness with globalization. We saw it in the UK with Brexit, which was in many ways a sort of a representative of globalization. And even though in the Brexit campaign, voters were told that the UK financially benefited from being in the European Union, and it did, because it was a matter of efficiency and everything else we like about globalization. Even so, they voted against remaining in the European Union because they just didn't like the concept. And we saw that in the US as well, even though many politicians, elected politicians, have made the case that it makes financial sense to trade a lot with other countries because consumer goods become cheaper and you, ordinary citizens, benefit from cheaper goods. People still many people, I shouldn't say people generally, but many people still felt that, no, I still don't like it. I feel that others are taking decisions on my behalf. I want it to be different. So that's the first part we saw. And then when I started really realizing that something was changing fundamentally was when companies operating, Western companies operating in Russia and China started saying, well, it's just not the same. It's starting to become too risky. And one aspect was, of course, increasing authoritarianism in both countries. And so, for example, I remember a decade ago, the CEO of a paper and pulp company said, we are not going to invest in Russia anymore. We're only going to do maintenance investments. And that was an outlier at the time. Most Western companies that were active there kept being active there, even though Russia had annexed Crimea and so forth. They still felt on balance it was attractive enough to stay there. But if you're in the paper and pulp company, a paper and pulp business, you grow trees, and that means you have a very long perspective because a tree takes up to 100 years to grow. And so he and his company made the decision that Russia was just not going to be stable enough for the next 100 years. So they reduced their operations there. And then we saw similarly in China, a little bit of a different scenario, but nevertheless a scenario where Western companies felt it was getting less safe for them to do business. And then we started seeing raids on Western companies in operating in China. And we also saw China essentially edge some companies out of the country because they were no longer part of the authorities' plan for how China was going to position itself. So it was trying to position itself away from low-end manufacturing to high-end manufacturing. And if you're a business and you see those risks, you will start having doubts. Obviously, you're not going to then leave the country altogether, but you see risks that are developing, whereas statistics only see developments in hindsight. So those are the things I started seeing, that essentially the increasing concern among Western businesses, Western executives about Russia and China in particular. And we should remember these are the two crown jewels of globalization, right? If it's no longer desirable or safe enough to do business there, and if companies start getting concerned, then globalization is not the same anymore. And then, of course, we had the third element, which was voters at home. So globalization started losing adherents, followers, believers very rapidly and from very different quarters.
Ishwar, on that note, you once ran the IMF's China division, and I'm curious how much of an impact the so-called China shock has had on all of these discussions we're having. What did it do to manufacturing in other countries? Why is that germane to the reaction we're seeing today?
So China had a very big impact on manufacturing, especially in the US. Now, one might argue that as the world opened up to trade, it was going to be inevitable that a relatively high wage economy like the US would find itself at a competitive disadvantage relative to lower wage countries. And when China joined the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s, it did get access to US and other foreign markets. Now, there was a sense, though, that China did not really play by the rules. It gained access to markets in many countries, including the United States, but did not quite give foreign companies, including US companies, the same access to its markets. Now, there were many American companies that started using China as a very important part of their supply chains. And recognizing that the Chinese market was expanding very fast, they wanted to be able to sell into that market. So, in fact, American companies, both looking to China as a market and as an integral part of their supply chains, wanted very dearly to maintain good relationships between the US and China. So, in my view, one of the critical components in the relationship between the two countries, at least the economic part of the relationship being relatively stable, is that American companies, including financial institutions that wanted access to Chinese markets, tried to keep things on an even keel. That balancing force has disappeared in the last few years. There is a sense that China was never going to keep to its commitments to open up its markets. If a Chinese firm was going to take American investment, it was going to require technology transfers from that company. German and Japanese companies investing in China in the form of joint ventures have also felt that their lunches have been eaten by Chinese companies that took their technology and then became super competitive. So China really did sway the debate in a very important way. There were certainly other forces at play, including technology, that were really undermining the role of low-skilled workers in economies like the United States. But it's always a lot easier for politicians to pin blame on a foreign power. Now, I do want to mention that China plays a critical role in the current conjuncture as well, because the US is throwing up tariffs, and the logical response from other countries, as happened during the first Trump administration, might be to band together and say, to hell with the US, let's trade more among ourselves. The problem, though, is that in the last 3 or 4 years, the Chinese economy has done moderately well, and it has done moderately well only because there has been a lot of state financed investment undertaken by state owned companies that have built up an enormous amount of capacity to produce in China, while household consumption has not kept up. So there is a huge amount of excess supply in China that has to find a home. China wants to increase domestic consumption, but it's not happening. So now the rest of the world is terrified because you have on the one side US tariffs throwing up a barrier that prevents countries' exporters from reaching what is the largest consumer market in the world. And at the same time, you have the second largest power in the world desperate to push out its exports. And none of the rest of the world wants Chinese exports to wash up on their shores and dominate their industry. So now we are caught in a very difficult trap. So perhaps we should talk about this as China shock 2 or 3, which is really going to have an effect in terms of global trade realignments.
Eswar Prasad, Elisabeth Braw, thanks for joining us.
It's been fun, Ravi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lots more coming up on FP Live. Next week marks 100 days of the second Trump administration. On Monday, another FP columnist, Emma Ashford, will join me to take stock of the White House's moves so far and also to explore what is driving them. And then on Wednesday, you can put your questions directly to me for a special Ask Me Anything edition. We'll talk about Trump, of course, but really anything is fair game. Register for those right here at foreignpolicy.com/live. Remember, you can listen to this show and past episodes for free on our podcast. That is FP Live, wherever you get your audio. I'm Ravi Agrawal. Thanks for joining us.